This is not a story about strangers. This is a story about children who forgot their parents while counting land, rooms, and money. Two old parents waited for a kind word. They waited for love, but their children waited for documents. No one asked, "Are you tired? Did you eat? Are you okay?" They only asked, "Who gets what?" Stay with this story until the end, because what this family lost cannot be written in any will. And if this story touches your heart, like, subscribe, and listen carefully, because this lesson is meant for all of us. Chapter 1. A house full of voices, a heart full of silence. The house was never quiet. From early morning until late night, voices filled every room. Phones rang again and again. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps moved fast across the floor. To anyone outside, it looked like a happy and successful home. James and Margaret lived in that house with their 4 grown children: Daniel, Susan, Robert, and Linda. All of them were busy. All of them had plans. All of them had strong opinions. But none of them had time. At the breakfast table, Daniel spoke loudly about his business problems. Susan complained about her office work. Robert checked his phone and talked about investments. Linda discussed changes she wanted to make to the house. James sat quietly at the corner of the table. His tea became cold before he finished it. Margaret served everyone carefully, even though her hands trembled slightly. No one noticed. No one asked James why he coughed so often. No one asked Margaret why she walked more slowly now. The house was full of sound, but empty of care. James was 72. He had worked his whole life to build this home. He had repaired walls, fixed doors, and planted trees with his own hands. Margaret had raised the children inside these walls. She had cooked every meal and stayed awake through every fever. Now they lived in the same house, but felt invisible. In the evenings, James liked to sit near the window. He watched the tree he planted years ago. It had grown tall and strong. Margaret folded clothes quietly, even when there was nothing left to fold. Sometimes she wanted to say, "I feel tired." Sometimes James wanted to say, "Sit with me for a while." But their children were always busy, always talking, always rushing, so the words stayed inside. Laughter still existed in the house, but it was quick and shallow. It did not reach the parents' hearts. Love was no longer spoken. It was assumed. The house was crowded, yet James and Margaret felt alone. And in that silence, hidden behind noise, something fragile began to break. Chapter 2. The Will That Was Never Written. One evening, after dinner, Margaret spoke softly. "We are getting older," she said while clearing the table. "We should talk about the future." The room became quiet, but not warm. James smiled gently and waved his hand. "Not today," he said. "We have time." But the word future stayed in the air. Daniel looked thoughtful. Susan stopped eating. Robert leaned back in his chair. Linda crossed her arms. No one spoke openly, but everyone thought deeply. Daniel thought about the front rooms of the house. They were bigger and received more sunlight. Susan remembered how much money the land was worth. Robert calculated values in his head. Linda believed she deserved more because she lived there. No one said these thoughts aloud, but they all assumed something. James trusted love. He believed his children would always stay united. Margaret trusted kindness. She believed sharing would come naturally. They did not realize that trust had slowly changed into expectation. That night, small conversations happened in corners. Daniel spoke quietly with Susan. Robert searched property prices on his phone. Linda measured rooms with her eyes. No arguments happened. No harsh words were spoken. Yet something had shifted. From that day, every conversation felt different. Smiles became careful. Words were chosen slowly. Eyes watched reactions. At the dinner table, silence felt heavy. Each child believed something was already promised, even though nothing was written. There was no will, there were no papers, but ownership had already begun in the heart. James and Margaret went to bed that night feeling uneasy. They could not explain why. They had spoken only one simple sentence, yet the house felt colder. The future had entered the home quietly, and with it came silent division. Chapter 3. Small Words That Started Big Cracks. The change did not happen suddenly. There was no shouting, no open fight, no angry scene. It began with small words. One afternoon, Daniel laughed while drinking tea. "If the house is divided someday," he said casually, "I should get the front rooms. They are closer to the road." Susan smiled, but her smile was tight. "Only if you pay extra," she replied lightly. Everyone laughed, but the laughter felt strange. Robert raised his head from his phone. "The land behind the house is actually worth more," he said. "It could be sold easily." Linda frowned. "I live here," she said. "That should matter." The conversation ended quickly. No one argued, no one apologized, but something stayed behind. From that day, words became sharper, not loud, just heavy. "This is my right," someone would say. "I deserve this," another replied. Jokes slowly turned into reminders. Reminders turned into silent competition. At meals, people listened carefully, not to understand, but to protect their position. Smiles came late, silence came early. James noticed it clearly now. He heard how voices changed when property was mentioned. He saw how eyes avoided his when he entered the room. Margaret felt it too. Her chest felt heavy when discussions stopped suddenly. The house had not changed physically, but emotionally it was breaking. Children started sitting in fixed places at the table, as if marking territory. Doors closed more often. Conversations happened in low voices. Trust, once natural, now needed proof. James tried to speak once. "This house belongs to all of you," he said, gently. "It was built with love." Daniel nodded. Susan agreed softly. Robert smiled. Linda said nothing, but their eyes told a different story. They were already divided. That night, Margaret cried quietly in bed. James held her hand but said nothing. He did not know how to stop something he could not see clearly. The cracks were still small, but they were growing, slowly and silently. Chapter 4. Love Measured in Square Feet. The house stopped being a home. It became a calculation. Rooms were discussed again and again. Measurements were made. Walls were touched and examined. "This room is larger," Daniel said one morning. "This wall can be moved," Susan suggested. "The backland has more value," Robert explained. "I have stayed here the longest," Linda reminded them. No one talked about memories. No one talked about birthdays celebrated in the living room. No one talked about nights when James stayed awake to help with studies. No one talked about Margaret's laughter filling the kitchen. Those memories no longer mattered. James watched his children walk through the house like strangers. They pointed, measured, and imagined future changes. Margaret followed them silently, her eyes full of questions no one answered. Once she said softly, "This room is where you all slept together during storms." No one responded. They were too busy calculating. Love was measured in square feet now. The house felt colder, even during warm days. Doors were closed more often. The air felt heavy. James felt tired easily. Margaret forgot to eat sometimes. Their health quietly worsened, but no one noticed. Discussions about the house became daily events. Voices rose slightly, accusations hid behind polite words. This is fair. That is logical. I deserve this. The word care was never spoken. The house no longer welcomed James when he entered a room. It no longer comforted Margaret when she sat alone. It had become an asset, and assets do not feel pain. Assets do not remember love. James sat near the window one evening, watching the tree he had planted long ago. It stood strong, untouched by arguments. Margaret joined him, holding his hand. "This house was meant to keep us together," she whispered. James nodded slowly. "But we taught them to build walls, not to protect hearts." The house still stood, but its soul was slowly disappearing. Chapter 5. Parents Who Became Invisible. As the arguments grew louder, the parents grew quieter. James woke up every morning with pain in his chest. Some days he felt dizzy when he stood up too quickly. Margaret's knees hurt badly, and her hands shook when she carried plates. They never complained. They believed their children were just busy, but busy slowly turned into blind. James missed a doctor's appointment because no one was free to take him. Margaret forgot to eat lunch many days because she felt tired and alone in the kitchen. No one noticed. At the dinner table, conversations continued about property, work, and money. Plates were filled and emptied quickly. Phones stayed in hands. Eyes stayed down. James tried to speak once. "I don't feel very well today," he said softly. Daniel nodded without looking up. "Rest, Dad," he replied, already busy with a call. Margaret wanted to say something too. She opened her mouth, but Susan was already talking about repairs, so she closed it again. Emotional neglect became normal. It did not hurt loudly, it hurt quietly. The deepest pain was not illness, it was being unseen. James sat alone more often now. Margaret spent long hours in silence. They moved carefully through the house like guests, afraid to disturb important discussions. Sometimes Margaret stood in the doorway and watched her children argue. She wondered when love had turned into calculation. She remembered nights when she stayed awake caring for them. She remembered skipping meals so they could eat better. Now she felt like she no longer belonged. James felt the same. They lived in a house full of people, yet felt completely alone. And loneliness is heavier than any sickness. Chapter 6. When Family Meetings Turned Cold. Family meetings used to be warm. They once included shared meals, laughter, and stories. Now they felt different. They felt cold. Everyone sat carefully, choosing words like lawyers. Every sentence was measured. Every smile had a reason. Trust was gone. Daniel spoke first in one meeting. "We should clearly decide who gets what," he said calmly. Susan nodded. Yes, it will avoid future problems. Robert agreed. It's practical. Linda remained silent, her eyes sharp. James sat at the head of the table, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded tightly. No one asked how they felt. Discussions went on for hours. Voices rose slightly. Accusations hid behind polite language. That's not fair. You always think of yourself. I just want equality. Fear replaced love. Everyone feared losing something. No one feared losing each other. James tried to speak again. We raised you to share, he said quietly, not to compete. Silence followed. Then the discussion continued, as if he had said nothing. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. She did not want to be a burden. The meetings ended without agreement, but with deeper division. Each child left the room feeling hurt, suspicious, and angry. No one felt closer. That night, James and Margaret sat alone in the living room. We failed somewhere, Margaret whispered. James shook his head slowly. No, he said. We loved them too much and taught them too little about gratitude. The house felt colder than ever. Family meetings no longer brought unity, they brought distance. And once trust is broken, it is very hard to rebuild. Chapter 7. The day the house split in two. The change became visible one morning. Workers arrived early. They carried tools, bricks, and measuring tape. Dust filled the air. Loud sounds replaced silence. James stood near the door, confused. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Daniel answered without meeting his eyes. "We are just making things clear," he said. "It will reduce future problems." Margaret's hands trembled. "Clear?" she whispered. No one explained more. That day, walls were built. A long wall cut the house into two parts. One entrance became two. One path turned into separate directions. Doors that once stayed open were closed permanently. The house was no longer one home. James watched silently as the wall grew higher. Each brick felt heavy on his chest. Margaret sat on a chair nearby, tears falling without sound. This house was built with love. Now it was divided with fear. Children walked around the wall, planning their sides. They discussed electricity, water, and keys. They talked about boundaries and locks. No one talked about feelings. James remembered carrying his children on his shoulders through this same space. Margaret remembered cooking for everyone in one kitchen. Now, even the kitchen felt divided. The wall stood strong by evening. Physical separation had become permanent. That night, James could not sleep. He walked slowly through the house, touching walls that once heard laughter. Margaret followed him quietly. "They have separated their lives," she said softly. James nodded. "And we are standing in the middle," he replied. The house still stood, but unity was gone. The wall did not just divide rooms, it divided hearts. Chapter 8. The Quiet Collapse of Old Dreams. After the wall was built, the house became very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet. James and Margaret spent more time alone. They sat together, speaking very little. Words felt unnecessary now. James thought about the past. He remembered working late nights to pay school fees. He remembered fixing broken doors and leaking roofs. He remembered dreaming of family meals and shared laughter in old age. Margaret remembered skipping meals so the children could eat more. She remembered sewing clothes late at night. She remembered telling herself, "One day they will understand." That day never came. Their dreams slowly collapsed, quietly, without noise. No one apologized, no one asked for forgiveness. Life continued as if this was normal. James felt tired all the time. Margaret felt weak, but they said nothing. They did not want to disturb anyone. Some evenings, James sat near the window again. The tree outside still stood tall. Margaret joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. "We wanted one family," she whispered. James closed his eyes. "He gave them everything," he said softly, "except the lesson of presence." Regret sat with them like an unwanted guest. They wondered where they went wrong. They wondered if love alone was enough. The house no longer felt like their own. It felt borrowed, temporary. James once said quietly, "When we are gone, they will remember this house, but not us." Margaret held his hand tightly. "I hope they remember us," she replied, though her voice carried little hope. Old dreams faded, not with anger, not with shouting, but with silence. And silence, when filled with regret, is very loud. Chapter 9. The News That No One Expected. One morning, the house was unusually quiet. No arguments, no planning, no discussions about walls or rooms. James did not come out of his room. Margaret knocked gently on the door. "James?" she called softly. There was no answer. Fear entered her heart before her feet moved. She opened the door slowly. James was lying on the bed, his face pale, his eyes closed. Margaret screamed. The sound cut through the house like a knife. Daniel ran first. Susan followed. Robert dropped his phone. Linda stood frozen. An ambulance arrived quickly, but not quickly enough. The doctor spoke gently, but his words were heavy. James had suffered a massive heart attack. He was gone. The house that once echoed with arguments now echoed with silence. No one spoke. Daniel sat on the floor, staring at his hands. Susan cried openly. Robert felt his chest tighten with guilt. Linda could not stop shaking. Reality hit harder than any legal document ever could. James would never sit near the window again. He would never drink tea at the table. He would never speak softly about unity. Margaret stood quietly, holding James's hand for the last time. She did not cry loudly. Her tears fell silently, just like her pain over the years. The children looked at their father's face and felt something new: regret. Not for the arguments, not for the wall, but for the moments they missed. They remembered how often he waited, how often he watched them argue instead of laugh, how often he tried to speak but was ignored. The house felt smaller now. That night, no one talked about property. They sat together in silence, surrounded by walls they had built themselves. Guilt replaced anger, but guilt arrived too late. Chapter 10. Too Late to Say Sorry. After James's death, nothing felt the same. The walls still stood, the rooms still existed, the property was still there, but something priceless was gone. Margaret moved slowly through the house, like a shadow. She spoke very little. Her eyes searched for James everywhere, in his chair, near the window, beside the tree. The children tried to help now. Susan brought food. Daniel spoke gently. Robert offered money. Linda stayed close. But care cannot replace time. Margaret looked at them with tired eyes. "Your father waited," she said quietly. "He waited for your voices, not your gifts." Her words cut deeper than anger. The children finally understood. They had protected their shares, they had guarded their rights, but they had abandoned their parents. Property remained, but love was broken. One evening, they sat together where James once sat. Daniel spoke first, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was blind." Susan cried. "We thought there was time." Robert lowered his head. "We measured land instead of love." Linda whispered, "I thought I deserved more." Margaret listened silently. Then she said something they would never forget. "Parents don't want portions," she said softly. "They want presence." Soon after, Margaret's health declined. She followed James quietly, without drama, without noise. The house stood empty. The wall stood useless. The children inherited the property, but they lost something no document could return. They lost their parents' voices. They lost their chance to say sorry in time. They lost love they assumed would always wait. The house still stands today, but it no longer feels like home, because a home without parents is only a building. The lesson: they fought over property, they fought over rooms, they fought over ownership, but they never fought for their parents. Money can be earned again, land can be bought again, houses can be rebuilt, but time with parents, once lost, never returns. If your parents are still alive, don't wait for regret to teach you love. Call them, sit with them, listen to their stories. Because one day the house may still stand, the walls may still exist, but their voice will be gone forever. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you love. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because every story here is a reminder of what truly matters in life.